My best friends live in the woods. The Adventures of Albert by Anne Michelle Moracek.
In a dream, in a trance, my spirit flies to the pink horizon of the forest, where fairies say, "Come and play," and the animals say, "There's a better way," an enchanted land of love. My best friends live in the woods.
Chapter 8. The True Lesson for Today. As you might suspect, most of the children of the forest are homeschooled. Most of the year, this is true. But during the 2 weeks before and after the longest day celebration, the Glen School is in session. All the children of the forest who are old enough but not too old attend. Many of the elders take turns teaching, and this way the collected knowledge of the forest is passed down to the next generation. This was Albert's first year attending. He and Jimmy Squirrel walked together to the glen. "I wonder who is teaching," Albert said as they walked. "Yeah," said Jimmy as he munched on an acorn, dropping bits of hull as they marched along. "Are you excited for your first day?" Albert asked Jimmy. "Not really. I'd rather be out playing," said Jimmy. But Albert was excited. He wondered about many things and hoped perhaps to find answers in school. They walked on in silence till they entered the glen. Several others were already gathered around. There were the Rabbit twins, Gabby and George, Tommy Red Fox, and several others they had not met before. Albert smiled at the possibility of meeting new friends. A large old crow paced back and forth and chirped, "Come in and have a seat." "I'll bet that's our teacher," Albert whispered to Jimmy. Jimmy flicked his tail and shrugged. He didn't much care. "Today's class will be on bird identification," he squawked as he paced. "Identi what?" Jimmy asked Albert. "No talking unless called on," scolded Crow teacher. Jimmy blushed and raised his paw. "Yes, Jimmy, you may ask a question," said the crow. "Identi what?" Jimmy repeated. "Identification," Crow repeated. "Being able to tell what kind of bird it is from just seeing a feather," Crow continued. "You will go out in teams of 2, collecting feathers, and we will meet back here when the sun is straight overhead." Gah! Crow dismissed the class to go on their assignment. Albert and Jimmy were a team, of course. "School might be better than I thought," Jimmy admitted. "This is fun." "How are we going to catch a bird and pluck a feather?" Albert said, more to himself than to Jimmy. He didn't expect Jimmy to have an answer. "Tiptoe up and grab 'em from behind," Jimmy offered. As Albert didn't have a better idea, that became their plan. There was a hummingbird hovering and darting her beak in and out of the orange trumpet flowers that were twining their way to the light up a nearby tree. "I don't think we can catch her," Albert admitted. "She's really fast." "But we could ask her for a feather," Albert offered. Jimmy boldly trotted up and stood at the base of the trumpet flower vine. "Good day," he said cheerfully as he was able. "We have a class assignment to collect feathers. Might we have one?" Jimmy asked. That's what Albert loved about Jimmy. He just jumped in. "Hum, hum, hum," she buzzed. "Well, all right." The tiny bird perched for a moment on the vine. With her tiny pointed beak, plucked out one of her shiny green-blue feathers. "Catch 'em," she hummed. The tiny feather looked like a jewel as it floated down to them, sparkling in the sunshine. "Oh, thank you ever so kindly," Albert said most sincerely. Jimmy had already started to scamper off. "Jimmy, where are your manners?" Albert scolded. "Get back here and say thank you." "Oh, thanks," he called back with a flick of his tail and continued toward the next clearing. Albert carefully placed the jewel feather in his pocket and followed Jimmy. "Sometimes a bit more serious wouldn't hurt," he thought as he watched Jimmy scampering off. After a bit, they came across Mrs. Robin Redbreast. "I'll ask this time," Albert told Jimmy. "We're attending Glen School today," Albert explained to the robin, "and our assignment is to collect feathers. Might we have one?" Mrs. Robin took a few hurried steps and stopped still. "What are you doing?" Jimmy asked. "Shh, shh, shh, shh. Be quiet," Mrs. Robin said. "What are you doing?" Jimmy repeated more softly. "I was listening for worms before you two noise monsters showed up," she snapped. "You can hear worms under the ground?" Albert said in amazement. "Of course, can't you?" Mrs. Robin answered. "No," the boy said. "Wow, you have superpowers," Albert said, truly impressed with Mrs. Robin. No one had ever told her she had superpowers before. She liked that very much. "I suppose you could have a feather," she said, taking a closer look at the boys. "What color would you like?" Mrs. Robin did indeed have browns and blacks, but the most impressive were the red feathers on her chest. "I know they're most precious to you, but if you please, could we have a red one?" Albert asked quietly. "What a polite young one," she chirped, and she plucked a choice red feather for him and flew off. As Albert placed it in his pocket, the boys noticed the sun was almost overhead. "We better get back," they agreed. As they entered the Glen School, Crow Teacher was again pacing in front of them. He called on the Rabbit twins first. "Gabby and George, what feathers did you bring to show the class?" The bunnies pulled forth from their pockets 3 black feathers that looked a mess, tattered and broken. "How did you come to find these feathers?" Crow Teacher asked. "They are quite a mess." We found them on the 4th floor," the twins explained. Okay. What kind of a bird do you suppose lost them?" Crow Teacher asked. "A blackbird?" they said shyly. "Could be," said Crow Teacher, "but many birds have black feathers, so we will never know for sure." When Teacher called on Albert and Jimmy, the class gasped in delight at the jewel feather and the lovely red one. "Nicely done," Crow Teacher squawked. "We know exactly what birds they came from," Albert volunteered, "because the hummingbird and Mrs. Robin gifted us with them when we asked." "And that will be the true lesson for today," Crow Teacher said proudly. "Good things come to you when you ask politely. Class dismissed." Albert was so happy with himself. He had made Teacher proud. Just then, he noticed a little girl sitting across the glen with her hands folded on a tiny pink apron. She was staring at Albert and blushed when she was caught. She had a long, bushy, striped tail wrapped neatly around her and a mask of black fur around her eyes that Albert seemed to recognize. "Who is that?" Albert asked Jimmy, but Jimmy was already scampering off and Albert felt he had to follow. She's so pretty, Albert thought to himself all the way home.